In this video, I want to talk about the development of the ritual of the funeral of the Pope. Much has been said in recent weeks of the reform of the ceremonial ahead of the funeral of the late Pope Francis. In truth, papal funerals were considerably reformed in the 20th century. Changes started to be made with the funeral of Pius XII in 1958, with major revision and a lot of simplification for the funeral of Paul VI in 1978. What Pope Francis has done ahead of his own funeral is just to simplify things a little further while maintaining the core elements of the tradition. So I'm first going to explore with you the fullness and splendour of the traditional papal funeral ceremonial as it was before the 20th century reforms, before then looking at what has been changed in the last 60 years or so. Up to and including the funeral of Pope John XXIII in June of 1963, the funeral rituals of the Pope were long, drawn-out and extraordinarily elaborate. They were in essence ceremonies from the late Middle Ages. Unsurprisingly, given that popes were major temporal as well as spiritual rulers at least until 1870, these ceremonies differed very little from those that accompanied the death and burial of any Catholic sovereign in late medieval Europe. Once you finish this video, it would be well worth you watching my other video on the funeral of Henry VIII of England, just to see how the two compare. There's very little difference. The modern idea that a powerful man, and popes are still powerful people, might have a simplified funeral, a simple funeral, would have been completely unthinkable to people in the past. A show of pomp and prestige and a certain degree of theatricality and display was an expectation for the funerals of all the social elite, as it underlined the continuing importance of the office and the position that they held. Pomp and splendour continued to be a hallmark of papal funerals right up until 1963, and it therefore provides a fascinating insight into the sumptuousness of late medieval and early modern Catholic funerary rites in general. It was the natural conservatism and the guarding of tradition within the Catholic Church, as well as a certain degree of insularity due to political changes, that ensured that these ceremonies were retained for so very long, when in nearly every other instance, due to changing social attitudes, such grand funerals were the thing of the past in Europe. There is a wonderful source in French from the 19th century that provides a detailed account of the procedure and ceremonial of papal funerals at that time, and it will form the basis of my account of papal funerals before the 1970s reforms. Entitled Le Conclave et le Pape, the conclave, copious number of photographs and engravings from the... And this work includes a very... To this, we can add a range of other sources, particularly the copious number of photographs and engravings from the late 19th and 20th century, and even from the middle of the 20th century, the evidence of film and newsreels. Before the 1990s, there was no formal instruction manual for the funeral of a Roman pontiff. Tradition, precedent, and the will of the departing pope controlled what ritual would take place. It was only in the year 2000 that the rites were formalised in a volume called Ordo Exequarum Romani Pontificis, the order for the funeral of Roman pontiffs, which in 2024 Pope Francis then revised. So let's begin where the whole funeral begins, with the domestic rituals surrounding the death of the Pope. One thing that differs from the papacy is that during the course of papal history, popes have very rarely occupied the apostolic palace at the Vatican. Medieval popes, before the papacy was moved to Avignon in southern France, primarily lived at the Lateran Palace beside the papal basilica of St. John Lateran, the Pope's own cathedral, and many popes died there. It was only after the end of the Avignon papacy and the end of the Western Schism in the early 15th century, and with the Lateran Palace then in very poor condition due to a number of fires, that popes began to reside at the Apostolic Palace next to St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, which was newly built from 1447 onwards. However, their residence there was relatively brief. From the 1580s until 1870, the primary residence of the Pope was the newly built Quirinal Palace, and most popes in that period died there. It was only In 1870, with the unification of Italy, the end of the Papal States, and the seizing of the Quirinal, the popes began to reside more permanently at the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican and died there. Of course, the location of the Pope's death dictated to some degree the form of the ceremony as it would unfold. On his deathbed, a pope was rarely alone. He was accompanied there by his household, his prelates, his chaplains, and members of the wider papal court. Also in attendance, once the Pope's death seemed imminent, were members of the community of Vatican penitentiaries, the Vatican confessors, who since 1774 had been Franciscan friars. They would have a role in caring for the body. An official called the prefect Pope. As soon as the Pope breathed his last, the members of the household in attendance covered his face with a white cloth and began immediately the funeral rites. An official called the prefect of the pontifical ceremonies then went and informed the Cardinal Camerlengo that the Pope had died. The Cardinal Camerlengo, or papal chamberlain, was the most powerful official at the papal court, and during the time when the papacy was vacant, he acted as a form of regent. And given his important status and power, it was his role to officially determine the death of the Pope. On arrival at the Pope's chamber, the Camerlengo first knelt in prayer before he began the formal work of determining the Pope's death. The cloth was removed from the Pope's face, and the Camerlengo ascertained if life was truly extinguished by calling the Pope by his baptismal name 3 times and asking him in Latin, Tu dormis or tu vivis? Are you asleep or are you alive? And then striking the Pope's temple each time with the silver hammer. Now, I have read that the use of the silver hammer is a bit of a myth, but de Monte records it, as do other sources, and so I'm relating it. Dead. Sent out by the papacy, though in the early modern period, up until 1842, it was used in funeral rites. Popes have long been embalmed prior to their funerals, a necessity given that there was at least a 6-day delay between which were known in Rome as the precautions for the embalming of lean and adiposal corpses. After evisceration, the body of the Pope was rubbed with balm, with oil impregnated with sweet, and convictia were sealed with cordia of Sixtus V, particularly in the Mediterranean climate, for although it compromised the whole integrity of the body, it stopped the rapid decay of the corpse. This form of embalming required the disposal of the entrails of the deceased. In 1590, at his death, the Precordia of Sixtus V, the first pope to die at the Quirinal, started possible, fronting onto the Trevi fountain, and this started a long-lasting papal tradition. Built in the mid-17th century, and a chamber was constructed behind the high altar to contain the papal entrails and hearts. On the evening of the day of the Pope's death, the Precordia were sealed within a large ceramic vessel. Here is the sealing ceremony of Leo 1903. More modern processes of embalming have generally rosetta, a form of cape, and his choir dress, and on his head a red velvet fur-lined hat called the camaro. Thus he was laid out on his bed in his private chamber. On the second day of the cuirassiers, while in the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican, the lying in state took place in the Clementine Hall. It was following the removal of the Pope's body from his chamber to the hall, that the private apartment, with the Vatican penitentiaries carrying torches beside it. The procession was accompanied, the body was moved at much the same time from the Clementine Hall to the Sistine Chapel. The body was then placed at the centre of the Sistine Chapel, where during the course of the night, the Vatican penitentiaries redressed a canaletto. They were surrounded by multiple wax candles, with the Vatican penitentiaries keeping vigil all night. On the morning of the third day after the Pope's death, the chapter of St. Peter's Basilica came to collect the body of the pontiff from the Sistine Chapel, and it was given into their care by the Vatican penitentiaries. 3-day public lying took place in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, which was halfway up the nave. The feet of the Pope were placed very close to this time. Requiem masses and offices for the dead, for the deceased popes, bishops, emperors, kings and nobles. It's a time when there was no mass media, but for more information on the form of that, see my earlier video on that subject. The silver to the months beyond that number of years then take the body to its burial place. It is a quite extraordinary detail of these rituals, but up to and including Pius known as the Sepolcro Provisorio, the provisional tomb. In the 19th century, when de Monto was writing this provisional tomb, a crane to a marble sarcophagus placed in this elevated position. After the coffin had been deposited inside, the front opening of the sarcophagus was then sealed with a marble stone bearing the Pope's name, and on top of the sarcophagus was placed a cushion and papal tiara made of stucco. The coffin sometimes remained in this provisional burial place for many years, until another burial place had been prepared. The sarcophagus is no longer occupying the sepulchre in the Vatican grottos below the basilica was completed, and in this photograph you can see the workmen putting in place for the dead would be performed, which is where the requiem masses for the Pope would then be to provide a focus for requiems, was put in a new position. At the very head of the number of candles was reduced from the temporary tomb. The closed coffins were then winched down. Wholesale changes came in 1978 for the funeral of Pope Paul VI, which of course followed the liturgical revolution of the Second Vatican Council. The earlier parts of the ceremonial remained more or less unchanged. The Pope's body continued to remain in the papal residence until the third day after death. Guards were abolished. They walked beside the coffin of Pope Francis as he was taken to the basilica. For Paul VI and all his successors, the public lying in state took place on the spot, first placed in his coffin laid on a low wedge-shaped platform for his lying in state. Since 1978, the towering catafalques that provided a focus for the obsequies during the Novum Dialis has been dispensed with entirely. This was in line with the new liturgical norms. Established of continued to be rites was abolished too. The culmination of the public before the Mass, the coins, the regito, have been added to the coffin, and the inner temporary altar erected on the steps of the basilica. At the end of the Mass, a final commendation of the Pope has taken place, after which he is directly before the interment in a permanent place of burial. Some may lament reform, but tradition is never. Gibbs across the world is offered in print and night.